He had only $1 left. It was meant to buy medicine for his sick mother. But when he saw a homeless man freezing on the street, the boy made a choice that would change both their lives forever. 2 days later, someone knocked on his door. The winter wind cut through the streets of Chicago like a knife. People hurried past the crowded sidewalks, wrapped in expensive coats and scarves, barely noticing the people who had nowhere warm to go. Among them walked Daniel, a 12-year-old boy wearing an old brown jacket that was too small for him. His shoes were worn out. One of the soles had begun to separate from the bottom. But Daniel didn't care. He was thinking about only one thing: his mother. She had been sick for several weeks. Every morning, she tried to smile when Daniel left for school. Every evening, she apologized for not being able to work. And every night, Daniel heard her coughing through the thin walls of their tiny apartment. That morning, before he left, his mother had pressed a single dollar into his hand. She looked at him with tired eyes. "Daniel, please use this to buy the medicine after school." Daniel looked down at the dollar. It wasn't much, but to them, it was everything. He closed his fingers around it. "I will, Mom." His mother smiled weakly. And Daniel, "Yes, don't worry about me." He smiled back. "I don't." But both of them knew he was lying. After school, Daniel walked toward the small pharmacy several blocks from his apartment. The cold was getting worse. Snow had started falling. He put his hands inside his pockets and felt the dollar again. He was almost at the pharmacy when something caught his attention. An old man was sitting beside a brick wall. He had no coat, only a thin, dirty sweater. His hands were shaking violently from the cold. People walked past him. Some looked away. Others stepped around him. One businessman even complained when the old man's cardboard sign blocked part of the sidewalk. Daniel stopped. He looked at the old man. Then he looked at the pharmacy. Then he felt the dollar in his pocket. He took a few steps toward the pharmacy. Stopped. Turned around. Looked at the old man again. The man's lips were turning pale. Daniel slowly walked toward him. "Sir." The old man looked up. His eyes were tired. "Yes, son. Are you cold?" The man gave a small smile. "Just a little." Daniel knew he was lying. He was freezing. Daniel sat down beside him. "Where's your family?" The old man looked away. "I don't have anyone." Daniel remained silent. Then he pulled the dollar from his pocket. The old man's eyes fell on it. Daniel held it out. "Here." The man stared at the money. "No, son. It's okay. You need it." Daniel shook his head. "My mom needs medicine." The old man looked confused. "Then why are you giving this to me?" Daniel looked at him for a moment. Then quietly answered, "Because my mom always says." He swallowed. "When you have something to give, you shouldn't wait until you're rich to give it." The old man's eyes filled with tears. He slowly reached for the dollar. But before taking it, he asked, "What's your name?" "Daniel." "And your mother's name?" "Sarah." The old man repeated it softly. "Sarah." As though the name meant something to him. Daniel stood up. "I should go." The old man grabbed his hand gently. "Daniel." "Yes. One day you'll understand." The old man looked deeply into his eyes. "That kindness never disappears." Daniel smiled politely. Then he walked away. The old man watched him disappear into the snowy crowd. For several seconds, he stared at the dollar in his hand. Then he noticed something written faintly on the corner of an old photograph inside his pocket. His expression suddenly changed. He pulled the photograph out. His hands began trembling. He looked at Daniel disappearing down the street. Then at the photograph. And whispered, "It can't be." Meanwhile, Daniel finally reached the pharmacy. He stood outside the door. He reached into his pocket. And suddenly remembered, he had given away the only dollar he had. Daniel lowered his head. His eyes filled with tears. He whispered to himself, "I'm sorry, Mom." Then he turned around and began walking home through the snow, not knowing that the old man behind him had just made a phone call that would change Daniel's life forever. Daniel walked home through the falling snow. Every step felt heavier than the last. He kept one hand inside his pocket, almost as if he expected the dollar to magically appear again. But it was gone. He had given it away. The medicine his mother needed was still sitting behind the pharmacy counter. And now, he had nothing. When Daniel finally reached their apartment, he stood outside the door for several seconds. He wiped the snow from his jacket. Then forced a smile onto his face. He didn't want his mother to know. He opened the door. Mom. Sarah was lying on the old sofa. She immediately tried to sit up. Daniel, you're home. Daniel smiled. Yeah. Sarah looked at him carefully. Did you get the medicine? Daniel froze. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Then he nodded. He looked down. The pharmacy was closed. Sarah knew immediately that something wasn't right. She had known her son for 12 years. She could hear a lie even when he tried to hide it behind a smile. Daniel. I'm fine, Mom. He walked toward the kitchen. Are you hungry? Sarah slowly sat up. Daniel, come here. He stopped. She reached for his hand. Look at me. Daniel turned around. His eyes were already wet. Sarah looked at him for several seconds. Then she noticed his empty pocket. The dollar. Daniel lowered his head. I'm sorry. Sarah's voice became soft. What happened? Daniel sat beside her. There was an old man outside. He explained everything. The cold. The man's trembling hands. The dollar. And the words his mother had once taught him. Sarah listened without saying a word. When he finished, she pulled him into her arms. Daniel began crying. I'm sorry, Mom. I know you needed the medicine. Sarah held him tightly. Don't ever apologize for being kind. But you're sick. I know. And you needed the medicine. I know. Then why aren't you angry? Sarah kissed his forehead. Because I may be sick. But I still have the richest son in the world. Daniel cried even harder. That night, they shared the little food they had left. Daniel gave most of it to his mother. She pretended not to notice. When he finally fell asleep, Sarah remained awake. She looked at her sleeping son. Then whispered, Please, God, don't let his kindness become the reason he suffers. Across the city, the old homeless man was no longer sitting beside the brick wall. He had entered a small cafe. A waiter looked suspiciously at his dirty clothes. But the old man didn't care. He placed Daniel's dollar on the table. Then took out his phone. His hands were still trembling. He dialed a number. Someone answered almost immediately. Hello. The old man spoke quietly. I found him. There was silence on the other end. Then, what? I found Sarah's son. The voice became tense. Are you sure? The old man looked down at the photograph. It showed a young woman standing beside him many years ago. She was smiling. Her name was Sarah. The old man's eyes filled with tears. I'm sure. He turned the photograph over. On the back was a handwritten sentence. If anything ever happens to me, please find my son. The old man closed his eyes. For 12 years, he had searched every city, every hospital, every shelter, every possible lead. Nothing. Until that afternoon, a 12-year-old boy had walked up to him in the snow and given him his last dollar. The old man whispered, He doesn't know who I am. The voice on the phone asked, Did you tell him? No. Why? The old man looked toward the window. I need to be certain. Certain of what? He paused, then said, that Sarah really kept him safe. The next morning, Daniel woke to someone knocking on the apartment door. 3 slow knocks. His mother was still asleep. Daniel quietly got out of bed. He walked toward the door. Another knock. He looked through the small peephole. And froze. Standing outside was the old homeless man. But something was different. He wasn't wearing the same dirty sweater. He was standing beside a black luxury car. And behind him were 2 men in expensive suits. Daniel slowly opened the door. The old man looked at him. His eyes immediately became emotional. Daniel. Daniel stared at him. How do you know my name? The old man didn't answer. Instead, he looked past Daniel, toward the woman sleeping on the sofa. The moment he saw Sarah, his face completely changed. Tears filled his eyes. He whispered, After all these years. Sarah suddenly woke up. She looked toward the doorway. And the color disappeared from her face. She stared at the old man. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Sarah whispered a name she hadn't said in 12 years. David. The old man's eyes filled with tears. Hello, Sarah. David. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. David stood silently in the doorway. For 12 years, he had imagined this moment. He had imagined finding Sarah in a crowded city. He had imagined asking her why she disappeared. He had imagined finally meeting the child she had taken with her. But he had never imagined finding her like this. Sick, living in a tiny apartment, and raising a 12-year-old boy who had just given away his last dollar to a stranger. Sarah slowly pushed herself up from the sofa. Her hands were trembling. Is it really you? David nodded. It's me. Sarah stared at him. Then she looked at the expensive car outside. Then at the two men standing behind him. Her eyes filled with confusion. What are you doing here? David looked at Daniel. The boy was standing beside his mother, completely confused. You know him? Daniel asked. Sarah didn't answer. David stepped inside. He looked around the small apartment. The old furniture. The empty kitchen. The medicine bottles sitting beside the sofa. His eyes became wet. Sarah. She quickly looked away. Please leave. David froze. Leave. Yes. After 12 years. Sarah's voice broke. You shouldn't have come. David looked at her. I searched for you. Sarah shook her head. You shouldn't have. I went to shelters. I know. I checked hospitals. I know. I hired people to find you. Sarah closed her eyes. And now you've found me. David nodded. Yes. Daniel looked between them. Mom. Sarah turned toward him. Daniel, go to your room. But, please. Daniel hesitated. He had never heard his mother speak like that. He slowly walked toward the bedroom. But before closing the door, he looked back. David was staring at him. There was something strange in the old man's eyes. Something Daniel couldn't understand. The door closed. Silence filled the apartment. David finally spoke. Why did you disappear? Sarah sat down. I had no choice. You could have called. I couldn't. You could have written. I couldn't. You could have told me about the boy. Sarah looked up sharply. Don't. David's voice softened. Sarah, you don't understand. Then make me understand. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. 12 years ago, I was terrified. David slowly sat across from her. Terrified of what? Sarah looked toward Daniel's bedroom. Of losing my son. David's expression changed. Your son. Sarah nodded. Daniel. David swallowed hard. You never told me his name. I couldn't. Why? Because if they found him. She stopped. David leaned forward. Who? Sarah looked at him. The people who wanted him. David's face became serious. Who wanted Daniel? Sarah wiped the tears from her eyes. Your brother. David suddenly went silent. My brother. Sarah nodded. Michael knew about the money. David's expression hardened. What money? The company. David stared at her. Sarah continued. Before you disappeared, you had already decided to leave everything to your son. David slowly shook his head. I don't understand. You were going to change your will. Sarah's voice trembled. You told me Daniel would inherit everything. David remembered. A conversation from 12 years ago. A conversation he had almost forgotten. He had been planning to protect his newborn son. But before he could change the documents, everything had fallen apart. Sarah continued. Michael found out. David's jaw tightened. And then, he threatened me. Sarah looked down at her hands. He told me that if I stayed, Daniel would never be safe. David stood up. Why didn't you tell me? I tried. Sarah's tears began falling. I called you. David stared at her. When? The night I left. David's face went pale. I never received a call. Sarah shook her head. I left you a message. David slowly stepped backward. What message? I told you where we were going. David looked toward the two men outside. Did you ever get it? Sarah shook her head. No. David's eyes filled with anger. Someone had stopped that message. Someone had made sure he never found them. For 12 years, he had believed Sarah had abandoned him. And Sarah had believed David had abandoned them. Neither of them knew the truth. David sat down again. His voice became quiet. Sarah. She looked at him. I never stopped looking for you. Sarah covered her face. I never stopped waiting for you. From behind the bedroom door. Daniel was listening. His eyes filled with tears. He didn't understand everything. But he understood one thing. His mother had been carrying a secret for 12 years. And that secret was connected to the homeless man who had appeared at their door. David suddenly looked toward Daniel's room. He stood up. There's something else you need to know. Sarah looked frightened. What? David reached into his coat. He pulled out the old photograph. The same photograph he had held the day before. He placed it on the table. Sarah looked at it. Her face changed. She recognized it immediately. You still have that? David nodded. You gave it to me 12 years ago. Sarah picked it up with trembling hands. On the back was the sentence she had written. If anything ever happens to me, please find my son. David turned the photograph over. Then he looked toward Daniel's room. I found him. Sarah began crying. But you didn't find him because of the photograph. David shook his head. No. He smiled through his tears. I found him because of his heart. Sarah looked confused. David continued. Yesterday, your son gave me his last dollar. Sarah closed her eyes. He told me you needed medicine. David nodded. He had $1. Sarah whispered. And he gave it to you. Yes. David looked down at the dollar he had carefully kept. I've met wealthy men who wouldn't give me a penny. His voice broke. But your son, he looked toward Daniel's room, gave me everything he had. Sarah cried quietly. David reached into his pocket. He placed the dollar on the table. I didn't come here to repay him. Sarah looked at him. Then why did you come? David took a deep breath. Because yesterday, when Daniel told me your name. He paused. I finally understood who he was. Sarah stared at him. David's eyes filled with tears. He isn't just your son, Sarah. Sarah's heart began pounding. David whispered. He is my son too. Behind the bedroom door, Daniel's eyes widened. He slowly placed his hand over his mouth. The old man outside the door, the man he had helped yesterday, was saying that he was his father. And then David said something that made Sarah completely break down. Daniel was never supposed to grow up without me. Sarah covered her face and sobbed. David looked toward the bedroom. But before I can tell him everything. He stopped. His expression suddenly became serious. There's one person we need to find. Sarah looked up. Who? David answered. Michael. Sarah's face turned pale. Because she knew. If Michael was still looking for Daniel, then finding Daniel after 12 years might have put the boy in more danger than ever before. And at that exact moment, Daniel slowly opened his bedroom door. Neither Sarah nor David noticed him. He was standing there, listening. Then his eyes moved toward the window. A black car was parked across the street. A man was sitting inside it, watching the apartment. Daniel whispered, Mom. Sarah turned around. Daniel pointed toward the window. Who is that man? David immediately rushed toward the window. He looked outside. The color disappeared from his face. Because he recognized the man in the car. It was Michael. And he had finally found them. David stood frozen beside the window. His eyes remained fixed on the black car across the street. Daniel looked at him. Who is that man? David didn't answer. Sarah slowly stood up. The moment she saw David's face, she knew something was wrong. David. He turned toward her. It's Michael. Sarah's face immediately lost its color. Daniel looked confused. Who is Michael? David walked toward him. Daniel, listen to me carefully. Daniel stared at him. Is he the man you were talking about? David nodded. Yes. Why is he watching us? David looked at Sarah, then back at Daniel. Because he knows you're here. Sarah covered her mouth. After 12 years, the past had finally found them. David quickly closed the curtains. Stay away from the window. Daniel stepped backward. Mom, what's happening? Sarah looked at her son. For years, she had tried to protect him from this truth. But now there was nowhere left to hide. She walked toward him. Daniel. Yes. There are things about your past that I should have told you a long time ago. Daniel looked at David. Like him being my father. Sarah froze. David looked at the boy. Daniel's eyes were filled with tears. I heard everything. Sarah slowly nodded. Yes. Daniel's voice trembled. Why didn't you ever tell me? Sarah took his hands. Because I was afraid. Afraid of Dad. No. She looked toward the window. Afraid of the people who wanted to hurt you. Daniel swallowed. Does Michael want to hurt me? David stepped closer. He wants something from you. What? David hesitated. Your identity. Daniel frowned. I don't understand. David sat down beside him. When you were born, I was a very wealthy man. Daniel looked surprised. David continued. But my wealth wasn't what mattered to me. He pointed toward Daniel. You were. Daniel stared at him. I planned to leave everything I had to you. Sarah lowered her head. But Michael found out. David nodded. He believed that if you disappeared, everything would eventually belong to him. Daniel's eyes widened. So he made Mom run away. Yes. Sarah began crying. I thought leaving was the only way to keep you alive. Daniel hugged his mother. You protected me. Sarah held him tightly. I would do it again. Suddenly, a car door slammed outside. David immediately stood. He looked through a tiny gap in the curtain. Michael had stepped out of the car. He wasn't alone. Two men stood beside him. David's face became serious. Sarah. What? They're coming. Sarah looked toward the door. Daniel's breathing became faster. What do we do? David looked at him. There's a back staircase. Sarah shook her head. No. David looked surprised. Why? I can't run anymore. Sarah. I've spent 12 years running. She wiped her tears. I'm tired. David stepped toward her. This isn't about running. He looked at Daniel. It's about keeping him safe. Daniel suddenly spoke. No. Both adults looked at him. Daniel shook his head. I'm not leaving Mom. David's eyes filled with emotion. You're brave. Daniel whispered. She protected me for 12 years. He looked at David. Now it's my turn to protect her. David smiled sadly. You shouldn't have to carry that burden. Before Daniel could respond, 3 loud knocks echoed through the apartment. Everyone froze. Knock, knock, knock. Sarah grabbed Daniel's hand. David moved toward the door. A man's voice came from the other side. Sarah. Sarah's eyes widened. She knew that voice. Michael. David quietly whispered. Don't answer. Michael knocked again. Sarah, I know you're in there. Daniel looked terrified. Michael continued. You've been hiding for 12 years. Silence. Then his voice became colder. But you can't hide forever. David looked around the apartment. There was nowhere to escape. He quietly opened a small cabinet beneath the kitchen sink. Inside was an old emergency phone. He picked it up. Sarah whispered. What are you doing? Calling the police. David dialed. But before he could speak, the phone suddenly went dead. David looked at the screen. No signal. Sarah's face fell. Michael's voice came through the door again. David. Everyone froze. Michael knew David was there. You always were predictable. David walked toward the door. Michael. Sarah grabbed his arm. Don't. David looked at her. I won't let him frighten you anymore. He stood behind the door. You've had 12 years. Michael laughed softly. And you still don't understand. David's voice became angry. What do you want? Everything. David clenched his fists. You already have more than enough. Michael replied. No. A pause. I want what was supposed to belong to me. David looked at Daniel. You mean my son? Michael became silent. Then he said. Yes. Daniel's eyes filled with fear. Michael continued. Open the door, David. No. Then I'll come in myself. A loud crash suddenly came from the hallway. Someone had kicked the outer door. Sarah screamed. David quickly pushed a heavy table against their apartment door. Daniel, get your mother into the bedroom. But, now. Daniel grabbed Sarah's hand. They moved toward the bedroom. David stayed behind. Another crash. The door shook. David looked around. Then he noticed something on the floor. The old photograph. It had fallen from the table. He picked it up. On the back was Sarah's handwriting. If anything ever happens to me, please find my son. David looked at the words. Then something suddenly clicked in his mind. A memory. A memory from 12 years ago. Michael had once asked him a strange question. What would happen if Sarah disappeared? At the time, David had thought it was just a strange question. But now, he understood. Michael had known. He had known everything. And there was something else. Something David had completely forgotten. The night Sarah disappeared, Michael had been the last person to speak to David. David's eyes widened. No. He remembered the conversation. Michael had told him, forget Sarah. She's gone. David had believed him. For 12 years, he had believed him. David whispered, you lied to me. The apartment door shook again. Michael shouted, David. David looked toward the bedroom. Then he looked at the old photograph. His voice became quiet. You didn't just take my son from me. He clenched the photograph in his hand. You stole 12 years from both of us. Suddenly, the door burst open. 2 men rushed inside. David stepped backward. Sarah screamed from the bedroom. Daniel ran toward her. One of the men grabbed David. David fought back. The second man moved toward the bedroom. Daniel saw him. Mom. Sarah pulled Daniel behind her. But before the man could reach them, a loud siren echoed outside. The man stopped. Another siren followed. Then another. Michael looked toward the broken door. His expression changed. David stared at him. You didn't expect that, did you? Michael looked furious. How? David smiled. You forgot one thing. Michael stared at him. What? David held up the old phone. I wasn't calling the police. Michael's face changed. I was calling someone else. At that exact moment, the hallway filled with footsteps. A group of officers rushed toward the apartment. Michael turned around, but there was nowhere to go. An officer grabbed his arm. You're under arrest. Michael struggled. You have no idea what you're doing. David looked at him. I know exactly what I'm doing. Michael was taken away, but as he passed David, he leaned closer and whispered something only David could hear. David's face suddenly changed. Michael smiled. You still don't know the whole truth. Then he was dragged away. David stood frozen. Sarah came out of the bedroom. What did he say? David looked at her. His voice was barely audible. He said. David paused. He wasn't the one who ordered you to disappear. Sarah's eyes widened. Then who was? David looked toward Daniel. And for the first time, he realized that Michael's betrayal was only the beginning. Because somewhere in the past, someone else had been controlling everything. And that person had been waiting for 12 years. To find Daniel. Then who was? Sarah's voice trembled. David didn't answer immediately. He looked toward the apartment door where Michael had just been taken away. Then he looked at Daniel. The boy was standing beside his mother, confused and frightened. David. Sarah stepped closer. Who was behind all of this? David lowered his voice. I don't know yet. Sarah's face fell. But Michael said. I know what he said. David looked down at the old photograph in his hand. He wanted me to believe that someone else was responsible. Sarah shook her head. Then why did he say it? David sighed. Because he knew I would be afraid. Daniel finally spoke. Afraid of who? David looked at him. That is what we're going to find out. An officer entered the apartment. Mr. David. David turned. Yes, we found something in Michael's car. The officer held out a small black envelope. David stared at it. What is it? We don't know. David took the envelope. His hands suddenly became cold. There was no name on it. Only one sentence written across the front. You should have left the past alone. Sarah saw the words. Her eyes filled with fear. David. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single photograph. David pulled it out. The photograph was old. Very old. It showed Sarah standing outside a hospital. She was holding a newborn baby. Daniel. But there was someone standing behind her. A man. David stared at the photograph. His face went completely pale. Sarah looked at it. Then she covered her mouth. No. David whispered. I know him. Daniel stepped closer. Who is he? David didn't answer. Sarah looked at him. David. He finally spoke. Your grandfather. Daniel froze. My grandfather. Sarah shook her head. No. David looked at her. Yes. Sarah's eyes filled with tears. I thought he was dead. David slowly turned the photograph over. There was a date written on the back. The same day Daniel was born. And underneath the date were 4 words. The boy must disappear. Daniel stepped backward. Mom. Sarah immediately hugged him. Don't listen. But Daniel was crying now. Why would my grandfather want me to disappear? Sarah looked at David. I don't know. David stared at the photograph. I do. Sarah's expression changed. What? David took a deep breath. Your father knew about the company. Sarah's eyes widened. He knew about the inheritance. David nodded. And he knew that if Daniel disappeared. He stopped. Sarah finished the sentence. Michael would eventually get everything. David nodded. But that still doesn't explain why he wanted Daniel gone. Silence. Then the officer spoke. There's more. David looked at him. What? We found a second envelope. The officer handed it to David. David opened it. Inside was a letter. He unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was old. Sarah recognized it immediately. Her hands began shaking. That's my father's handwriting. David read the first line. His face changed. He looked at Sarah. This was written 12 years ago. What does it say? David continued reading. Then suddenly stopped. Sarah grabbed the letter. She read it herself. Her eyes filled with tears. What? Daniel asked. Sarah couldn't speak. David took the letter back. Then he read the final paragraph aloud. Sarah. His voice broke. If you are reading this, then the plan has already begun. Sarah closed her eyes. David continued. Daniel is not safe because of the inheritance. Sarah looked confused. Then why? David reached the final sentence. And froze. Sarah whispered. Read it. David looked at Daniel. Then he read, Daniel is not just your son. He is the only person who can expose what happened 12 years ago. Silence. Nobody moved. Daniel stared at them. Expose what? David folded the letter. I don't know. Sarah shook her head. My father never told me anything. David looked at the photograph again. There has to be something. What? Something that happened the night you disappeared. Sarah suddenly remembered. Her eyes widened. The hospital. David looked at her. What about it? The night Daniel was born. She paused. There was another baby. David stared at her. What? Sarah nodded slowly. I remember. Daniel looked confused. Another baby. Sarah continued. There was a woman in the room next to mine. David listened carefully. She had a baby boy the same night. Sarah's voice trembled. But the next morning, she stopped. What happened? The baby was gone. David's eyes widened. Gone. The hospital said the baby had been transferred. To where? I never found out. David suddenly looked at the photograph again. Then at the letter. Then at Daniel. A terrible possibility entered his mind. Sarah. She looked at him. What if that baby wasn't transferred? Sarah's face became pale. What are you saying? David whispered. What if someone took him? Daniel looked frightened. Why would someone take a baby? David didn't answer. Because there was another question. A much bigger question. Why had Sarah's father written that Daniel could expose what happened 12 years ago? And why had someone spent 12 years trying to make sure Daniel disappeared? Suddenly, David's phone rang. Everyone jumped. He looked at the screen. Unknown number. He answered. Hello. There was silence. Then a man's voice. David. David immediately recognized it. His face turned pale. Who are you? The man laughed softly. You really don't remember me. David's eyes narrowed. Tell me who you are. The voice became serious. I was there the night Daniel was born. David froze. Sarah stepped closer. What did he say? David put the call on speaker. The man continued. I saw what they did. David's heart began pounding. What did they do? Another silence. Then the man whispered. They switched the babies. Sarah screamed. What? Daniel looked at his mother. David couldn't speak. The voice continued. Your son was taken from the hospital. Sarah began shaking. No. And another baby was placed in his room. David grabbed the phone. Who are you? The man answered. Someone who has spent 12 years trying to fix what they did. David's voice became desperate. Where is my son? The man paused. Then said something that made David's entire world stop. He's closer to you than you think. The call ended. David stared at the phone. Sarah was crying. Daniel stood completely still. Nobody spoke. Then Daniel quietly asked, Dad. David looked at him. Am I really your son? David walked toward him. He wanted to answer. But for the first time, he wasn't sure what the truth was. And then, the officer suddenly rushed back into the apartment. Mr. David. David turned. What happened? The officer was holding another photograph. We found this hidden inside Michael's car. David took it. His hands began trembling. The photograph showed two newborn babies lying in hospital bassinets. One had a small blue bracelet. The other had a small white bracelet. David looked at the names written beneath them. His breathing stopped. Because one name was Daniel, and the other name was David Jr. David stared at the photograph. Then slowly looked at Daniel. Sarah whispered, David. He couldn't respond. Because suddenly, the entire story of the last 12 years had become a lie. And somewhere in that hospital, someone had taken a baby. But the biggest question remained. Which boy had actually grown up as Daniel? David stared at the photograph. 2 babies, 2 names, 2 bracelets, and one terrible secret. Sarah slowly sat down. I don't understand. David looked at the officer. Where did you find this? Inside a hidden compartment in Michael's car. David looked back at the photograph. Then Michael knew. The officer nodded. We believe so. Daniel stood silently. His eyes were filled with tears. Dad. David turned toward him. Daniel's voice trembled. Am I really your son? David walked toward him. He wanted to say yes. He wanted to tell him that nothing had changed. But he couldn't lie. I don't know yet. Daniel lowered his head. Sarah immediately pulled him into her arms. Daniel, listen to me. He looked at her. Whatever the truth is. She touched his face. You are my son. Daniel began crying. But what if I'm not Dad's son? David stepped closer. You don't have to be my son by blood for me to love you. Daniel looked at him. David's eyes filled with tears. You gave a homeless stranger your last dollar yesterday. He smiled sadly. You didn't know who I was. You didn't know what I could give you. You didn't know anything about me. But you helped me anyway. David placed his hand on Daniel's shoulder. That is what makes you my son. Daniel hugged him. David held him tightly. Sarah watched them and cried. For the first time in 12 years. She wasn't afraid. Then the officer spoke. We found the hospital records. Everyone turned. What records? David asked. The original birth records. He handed David a folder. David opened it. Inside were 2 documents. The first belonged to a baby named Daniel. The second belonged to a baby named David Jr. David's eyes moved quickly across the pages. Then he stopped. Wait. Sarah looked at him. What? David pointed to the signatures. The records weren't switched. The officer frowned. What do you mean? David turned the papers around. Look at the timestamps. The first record had been created at 8:14 p.m. The second at 8:21 p.m. Daniel had been born at 8:09 p.m. David Jr. had been born at 8:17 p.m. Sarah stared at the documents. So, David took a deep breath. The babies were never switched. Silence. Daniel looked confused. Then why did someone make us believe they were? David looked at the photograph. Because someone wanted us to think they were. The officer suddenly understood. Michael. David nodded. He created the fake photograph. Sarah looked at him. But why? David's expression became serious. Because he needed me to believe Daniel wasn't my son. Sarah's eyes widened. He wanted you to give up your claim to him. David nodded. And if I believed Daniel wasn't my son? He looked at Daniel. I would stop searching. Sarah covered her mouth. That means. David smiled through his tears. Daniel is my son. Daniel's eyes filled with tears. Really? David nodded. Yes. Daniel ran into his arms. David hugged him tightly. I spent 12 years looking for you. Daniel cried against his chest. I thought you forgot me. David closed his eyes. Never. Sarah watched them. Then she suddenly noticed something on the floor. The old dollar. The same dollar Daniel had given David. She picked it up. David. He turned. Sarah held out the dollar. You kept it. David smiled. I couldn't spend it. Why? Because it was the first thing my son ever gave me. Daniel wiped his tears. I thought it was just $1. David shook his head. To you. He held the dollar carefully. It was everything. A few days later, Michael's lies were exposed. The hospital records proved that Daniel had never been switched. The photograph had been manipulated. The letter had been used to frighten Sarah. And the mysterious phone caller. He was a retired hospital employee who had discovered Michael's plan years ago but had been too afraid to speak. He finally came forward. Michael was arrested for his crimes. But David didn't care about revenge. He cared about one thing. His family. He took Sarah and Daniel to his home. It was the first real home Daniel had ever seen. There were warm rooms, a large kitchen, a beautiful garden, and a bedroom prepared just for him. Daniel stood in the doorway. This is mine. David smiled. Yes. Daniel looked at his mother. Mom. Sarah laughed through her tears. You deserve it. But Daniel shook his head. I don't need a big room. David looked surprised. Daniel reached into his pocket. He pulled out a small cardboard box. Inside was the old dollar. I want to keep this. David smiled. Why? Daniel looked at him. Because it reminds me. He paused. That even when you have almost nothing. He looked at his mother. You can still give someone hope. David's eyes filled with tears. He hugged his son. Sarah joined them. For the first time, the three of them stood together. No secrets. No fear. No running. Just family. Months later, Daniel's life had completely changed. But something about him never changed. Every Saturday, he went to the same street where he had first met David. He brought food, warm clothes, and medicine for people who couldn't afford it. One winter evening, Daniel saw an old homeless man sitting beneath the same brick wall. He walked toward him. The man looked up. Do I know you? Daniel smiled. No. He sat beside him, then reached into his pocket. He pulled out a $5 bill. The man looked surprised. You don't have to give me that. Daniel smiled. I know. The man stared at him. Then why are you giving it to me? Daniel looked toward the street where his father had once been sitting, and quietly answered, because someone once taught me that kindness never disappears. The old man smiled. Daniel stood up, then walked away through the falling snow. Behind him, the man looked at the money. And for a moment, he wasn't just holding $5. He was holding hope. And somewhere across the city, David watched his son from a distance. Sarah stood beside him. She leaned against his shoulder. You found him. David smiled. No. He looked at Daniel. He found me. And then he reached into his pocket. Inside was the original $1 bill. The last dollar Daniel had given him. He had kept it for the rest of his life. Because that tiny piece of paper had reminded him of something money could never buy. A child's kindness can change a life. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness can lead you back home.